So, welcome back to another episode of the Women Behind the Visor podcast with myself, Oliver Hickey, and Zoe Broad.
Hi.
So, this episode we're going to be talking about quite a major topic, and it's certainly one of the things which drew me, the producer of the Women Behind the Visor documentary / docuseries, into the project. Do you want to tell us a little bit about W-Series and just give us a kind of a brief, as it were, for people who don't know?
So it's an all-female single-seater racing competition, the first of its kind. So it was created in 2018 by Catherine Murbond, who I think she's the CEO of it. So I think she created it when she was on a career break and just wanted like a new venture, basically. But I think she's like an intellectual property lawyer, I think, in sports. So yeah, it was created by her, I suppose, to change the big issue of the lack of female representation in motorsport. I guess that's the main aim of the sport, I think, the series.
And rather like F1 or any sort of major motorsport competitions, it goes on every year. And there are multiple races. Does it come throughout the year, or is it more a certain month? You know, like football goes on for like a certain amount of months, and they'll take breaks. Does it have that kind of structure to it?
Yeah, I mean, they've only run one series, which was last year, which is the first season, and it was a much shorter series than, say, Formula One. I think it was about 5 or 6 races, and it was spread out over like same sort of structure as Formula One. That was a race every weekend or every couple of weekends. I think qualifying and the race were on the same day though, unlike Formula One where it sort of spread out over a weekend. And I think it was the support race to DTM, which is a big German touring car championship.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, obviously it only had one season. And then 2020 they were going to have another season, but it got cancelled kind of for obvious reasons. I guess it became kind of impossible because of COVID. I think their idea is to keep a yearly structure, to have one series every year, and then add. So I think then for the 2020 season they were planning to add a few more races than the previous year, and like the last few races were going to be at the same tracks as F1, so they would support races to F1.
Oh, okay.
There isn't like an F1 weekend is not the only F1's not the only race there. They have support series.
Oh, cool.
In like around it, and I think for the last few races, W Series was going to be a support race to Formula One, which is quite a big step. It was would have been quite a big step up. Obviously, it hasn't happened because of everything that's gone on.
So, why? One of my questions, and it's a question that I have about other sports as well, like, say, for example, football, we have yet to kind of find ourselves in a time where we can have not multi-gender, but sort of crossing genders in the same teams playing matches, so like, you know, women and men, kind of like tennis as well. That's a good example. You can have men and women doubles in there. Do you think there's any sort of reason why we haven't had, you know, female drivers in F1?
I mean, there have been 2 female drivers.
Oh, really?
Yeah, only 2 though, which considering there's, I think, something like about 900 odd drivers who've competed in Formula One since it started. As a very, very small minority of female. So I think that is. I mean, for other sports, there are reasons why men and women don't compete together, like in the same, compete in the same sort of game or match, is because there are physical differences. Biological physical differences between men and women, meaning that usually, women aren't as strong as men, and it's, they aren't as quick, and it's just a different physicality. So I think there are like genuine reasons why sports tend to be separated by gender, but motorsport is kind of the one that there isn't an obvious reason why it needs to be, if that makes sense. It's like, although there is a physical element, it's not, you're relying a lot on the car. A lot of it is the car. It's not close contact. It's not something like boxing or football where you're coming to close contact with the other person, so you need to be physically on the same sort of level. It's not really like that. You'll be relying a lot on the car. You've got a car. Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't think there's any difference between women and men when it comes to driving cars.
No.
Maybe when it comes to wrestling, if you got,
Yeah, exactly. I think in most sports there are physical differences. There must be reasons why women haven't been able to establish a presence in motorsport. Maybe it's not physicality. Maybe isn't the main reason, but yeah, there's got to be reasons, and I think that's probably the crux of what W Series is about. Is trying to sort of break those barriers and provide the opportunities for women where they maybe haven't been given the opportunity for various different reasons. I think it's a complex issue as to why women haven't been able to achieve a lasting presence in motorsport, I think. I mean, for one thing, it's like incredibly financially difficult to reach like the top levels of motorsport. Like I think Toto Wolff estimated it costs around like €8 million to get a driver from karting all the way up to like contention for like F1 racing, which is it's a crazy amount of money. And if I think that because there's been no precedent of women achieving success in Formula One, for example, sponsors aren't going to invest. They aren't going to be willing to invest in something or someone if there's no sort of precedent of them. Right. Do you know what I mean? It's a risk, isn't it? I think to support a woman going into Formula One because it's an unknown. It's an unknown territory, I guess. So that I think that financially is a big issue. It's not just for women, but for any racing driver, it's very difficult to get to Formula One. And considering that women are like a very small minority of racing drivers, like a very, very small percentage are women, it's almost impossible when you look at the statistics. Like I know every sport has, a lot of money invested in it, but I think motorsport it's got to be one of the most expensive sports in the world. Definitely.
It's frustrating it's frustrating to hear rather, because you sort of need one or two examples who do really well in Formula One, and then hopefully, like you say, people will be willing to spend more money and put sponsorships into younger drivers.
Yeah, it's just that there isn't a precedent for it. Do you know what I mean? If there's not been many successful female racing drivers in Formula One or the very, very top levels of motorsport generally, it is a risk for them. It's financial risk for sponsors, ultimately. I mean, one of the other reasons that's kind of quite a contentious issue is what I mentioned before about the physicality of it. So obviously it isn't like a sport like football, or you mentioned wrestling or boxing, where it's like close physical contact, and you notice the physical differences between men and women a lot more. But they're not easy to drive, these cars, and especially like they used to be like back in the day, like 70s and 80s, the cars were really, really powerful and they didn't have power steering and they were very, very hard to drive. So there is actually a lot more of a physical element to it. It's a lot more physically demanding than people, I think, realise. So there is that question mark of whether a woman would be physically fit enough or strong enough to sustain a season in Formula One. But you're never really going to know unless you give a woman the opportunity to actually do it.
Yeah.
There's the only way you're ever going to be able to tell if a woman could compete in Formula One. But yeah, I mean, I think W Series, this seems to be like, they do seem to have quite a focus on Formula One and the fact that there hasn't been a woman, there's only been 2 women ever competed in it. They do seem to have a big focus on that and, the financial side of it and what are the obstacles stopping women getting to that highest level. I know it's not the only type of motorsport, it's not the only, series around. There's plenty of other racing opportunities, but it is by far and away the biggest in the world. It's when people think of motorsport, that is, for most people, that's the first thing they think of.
No.
And it's quite alarming that there's been such little female representation in it.
So people like Catherine Bond, she's one of these people who, from listening to you talk, is actually one of the ones who is trying their hardest to create opportunities for women, and, making sure that the next 50 years are far more progressive than the last 50 years.
Yeah.
No. What are W Series doing to break the glass ceiling, as it were, in motorsport?
I mean, one of the biggest things I would say is that they've made it a lot more financially fair. There's a lot more parity in terms of finance because none of the drivers have to pay to get into the series. They don't need to find sponsorship and they don't need to raise a certain amount of money to get the seat, which pretty much every F1 driver has to raise a certain amount of money to get their seat every year. It's usually through sponsorship. Mm. So it's some ridiculous. You're talking like millions, tens of millions they need to raise for the team in order to get their seat. But in W Series, they don't need to do that. They don't need to raise any money, basically. It's fully funded. Mm. So it's purely about racing ability. So they all go in for like this qualifying that they do like before the season to select the driver. So it's purely based on like lap times and yeah, it's purely based on ability and talent, basically. Their selection process is nothing to do with money.
Which is something you would think would be like a global thing, or a sport-wide thing, rather than raising funds.
I mean, it should be. I mean, it's very. I mean, football has probably a lot more money in it that I would guess than Formula One, as an example. But generally, the players themselves don't need to find. They're not so reliant on finding financing quite so much. It's more about ability, like the scouts and the clubs. They look for ability in players, and then they invest the money in it because of that. And there is an element of it in motorsport, but it seems to be the sport where there is the biggest struggle financially. Like you see very few drivers who come from like working class backgrounds because it's very difficult to get into if you don't have money, basically. Yeah. Which is a shame, and yeah, it's probably one of the biggest issues. I mean, for me as a motorsport fan, it's not enough about talent. I think, particularly Formula One is the worst example of it. But yeah, I mean that seems to be what W Series. One of their biggest aims is to make it financially fair. What they also do is so unlike Formula One, where you have different teams and they all have different cars, and some cars are obviously a lot better than other cars, and that gives different drivers more of an advantage. They all drive, like in W Series, they all drive the same identical car. So there's no like advantage based on which team you get into in terms of having the best car. Like, they all have the same car. So it is, in theory, the best driver should win the race or the championship. Which, yeah, is crazy to think that that's a new and innovative idea, but it kind of is, especially in motorsport. It's a really innovative idea because it's not how it's done normally.
You see all these movies, racing movies, I suppose. So yeah, it got me thinking about Ford versus Ferrari when you were saying that, in terms of like companies pitting one another against each other, and the Ron Howard movie Rush, where it's McLaren versus Ferrari, I think, in terms of that kind of thing. But that's really cool to learn that in W Series they all drive the same car. It makes things a hell of a lot more like most other sports, tennis, football, where it is just the players in an even playing field in that respect.
I mean, I guess football being an example again, obviously there are different teams and some teams are better than others. So in that sense, it's not that different. But for the players themselves, it very much is like the cream rises to the top. There is a lot of obviously money and politics involved, but because it's not up to the players to find financial backing, it's all about talent. Like the best teams want to invest in the best players, and they want the best players in their team. So it works well for both sides. But although there is an element of that, I think especially in Formula One being the main example, there's been quite a few drivers who've lost out on seats in recent years. Esteban Ocon being an example, like Formula One driver, very, very talented, and lost out his seat pretty much because he didn't have the financial. There were other drivers who had more financial backing. So although there is an element of obviously teams want the best talent in their team driving their car, they need to also have the money behind them. And it's not the team's fault because they need to have they need to have a budget to build and maintain the car throughout the season, which costs millions. And part of that does come from the driver, unfortunately.
And go back to when you were talking about finances and people coming from possibly working class backgrounds and want to get into this sport. So when we spoke to Abby Pulling up in Derby in March at the F4 Media Day, she was telling us that her father, I think, did a lot of maybe MotoGP and.
I don't know if it was I think he's a biker. He like motorcycles.
Yeah.
That's what she was saying.
Yeah, and like she started out maybe doing little bits of go-karting and that kind of thing. And it got me thinking that, it's really nice to see parents influencing their children and, not necessarily saying, well, you're never going to do motorsport, honey, so, go in a park or, with a football or something, go play some golf or tennis or whatever. But it's nice to see the parents, actually saying, no, you can do this, it's an enjoyable sport, don't let money stop you.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at most the successful racing drivers, their parents are very, very, very supportive. A lot of them actually are interested in motorsport themselves. So they obviously fed that into their kids and taking them to race weekends and karting and all this sort of stuff. So yeah, often successful drivers, usually their parents are very, very supportive, which is great on one hand, but then what about the kids who don't necessarily have supportive parent or parents not just not supportive but who don't have the financial means to support their kids, you know what I mean? I think there's definitely a big issue with that in motorsport.
We've heard a lot about the benefits of W Series. I hate to ask, but is there anything which W Series could learn from? Is there any sort of lessons to be learned? Have they made any mistakes along the way?
I'm sure they have made mistakes. I mean, I don't know if...
Not looking for them actively, but, just to kind of...
I don't think they've made any mistake. Well, they probably have, I assume. I mean, they've only had one series, so I'm sure they've probably made a fair share of mistakes. But I think overall, the first series was actually very successful. But, I mean, it's not like the series isn't without controversy. Because there have been a fair few female racing drivers who have, especially when it initially was announced, they had less than positive views on it.
Okay.
I think the main issue is that, and it's an only all-female series and it's separated by gender. Because there's a lot of people who do believe, and I used to, the idea for 5 years ago for me, if you said to me that they were creating an all-female series, I would have no. There's no reason why women can't compete in motorsport. Well, I don't personally think there's a reason why women can't compete in motorsport alongside men. There's obviously people who would disagree with that. That, I think, is one of the biggest sort of criticisms that W Series faced, is that they're separating the sport by gender. Whereas a lot of people, a lot of racing drivers, a lot of female racing drivers don't think that's how it should be. They want to race on equal terms with men. I mean...
It's a decent observation and a decent statement on the situation. I think that's not necessarily restricted to motorsport. From the sounds of it, is I'm sure a lot of I think equality is a massive issue in our world at the moment, and a lot of people want equality all around, but I suppose being a movie person, it kind of brings up those questions of like an all-female led cast of a major franchise like Ghostbusters and Ocean's 8 and that kind of thing. But I suppose if people didn't make them, I personally think that the world is a lot more enriched because they made them. I suppose from a perspective of someone who didn't know that before, that they come out and said it, I feel that maybe they're missing the point of the series itself, and kind of, I don't know, perhaps. I personally think that it's terrific to have the W Series in motorsport. I think it's terrific to have things which are different. I think difference is such an amazing thing in our current years, in the years that 5 years past, and hopefully the rest of our years to come. I think we should have things like W Series to give that difference, not only of opinion but also of performance. Because if people see that these amazing competitors and these amazing drivers are doing this thing on W Series, then hopefully, like we were talking about before, they will be able to say, "Oh right, well, let's get him in Formula One, or let's get him in." I think it's a great, if anything, it's a great source of publicity for these drivers and great opportunity.
Yeah, I mean, there is hopefully going to be a trickle down effect in the rest of motorsport in providing, a precedent. I can never say this word. Precedent for women being successful in motorsport and providing more opportunities. But actually, what you said though about the film industry is a very good comparison, because it's like you mentioned about I've seen a lot of advertisements for all female crews, and changing things like Ghostbusters and making it an all female cast. And there's always like another example being Doctor Who, making a female Doctor Who.
Yeah.
And it is a thing of a lot of people. There is an argument both sides. One is that it's like you're forcing the issue. It's making it's contrived. It's like, rather than creating new things, you're sort of trying to force, sort of in certain things like Ghostbusters, Doctor Who, you're trying to sort of create female characters where the characters have traditionally been men. And there is an argument, especially with like all female crews as well, all female film crews, that it's sort of a reverse bias, if that makes sense.
Yes, yeah.
And the same could be said for not just for female, but for like BAM people, black and ethnic minorities, is that giving them the opportunity, specifically creating opportunities for them. So a lot of people say it is kind of a reverse bias.
Yeah.
That's one side of the argument, but the other side of the argument is, and this is my feeling about it, is that you need to force the issue, you need to create these opportunities, otherwise it's never going to happen. You're never going to get equal representation if you don't force the issue.
Absolutely.
And you don't create opportunities. And, have a kind of reverse bias and say, no, we only want female, or we only want BAM actors or crew. We only want these specific kind of people because we need to provide opportunities for them where there haven't been, unfortunately. Because there is an issue. Like, it's denying there's an issue. In saying it, I think. Yeah. It's a good comparison what you made, I think.
Yeah.
And that, I mean, from my perspective, I do get the opposition to W Series. Like I said, if you'd asked me 5 years ago, would I have wanted to watch like an all-female racing series? I said no, because I think that there's no reason why women can't compete alongside men. But then, there obviously have been reasons why women can't compete alongside men in motorsport, because it hasn't happened, or it has happened, but it's just not. Female representation is just nowhere near enough. So there's obviously is an issue. So saying that no, there's no reason to create W Series, or there's no positivity to come out of W Series, is kind of denying that there is an issue in the first place.
Right.
I think.
Yeah.
It not totally, but there's a little bit of denial. There's an issue, I think, in the first place. Something needs to be done. Do you know what I mean? It may not be the perfect solution, but something needs to be done to provide opportunities. And it's not just limited to W Series or motorsport. It is in anything. Film is another great example. It's not just actually gender inequality as well. There's a lot of racial inequality in motorsport. A lot. Like probably more than female, I think.
I'm sure we'll talk about that in another episode.
But it is an approach that some people like it, some people don't. And there's arguments for and against it. And I guess that's maybe always how it's going to be. Hopefully until one day there is complete equality. Maybe one day we'll see that, who knows.
Well, for one day, we can hope. And I think it will happen, hopefully at some point in the future.
Yeah.
So here's our weekly segment where we're talking about current drivers who are competing in races. Tell me. What's been going on?
So a couple of just highlight a couple of drivers. Jessica Hawkins, the W Series driver. She competed for the first time in the British Touring Car Championship, which is, if you don't know, is huge in this country. Yeah, one of biggest motorsport competitions. So yeah, it was pretty. She did it at Snetterton last weekend, so 24th and 25th of October, and competed there, which was great for her. So it was her debut, and such a big series. But yeah, no, it was great to see her doing that. And the other one I wanted to mention was Abby Pudding. So yeah, obviously we met her at British F4 Day, and she's had a pretty successful season in F4. And so this weekend she's competing in the Formula Renault Euro Cup at Imola. So it's this weekend, so the 31st and 1st of November. So it's the only support race to the F1 Grand Prix there this weekend, which is pretty incredible. So yeah, it's an F3 spec car, so for her it'd be the first step up from F4 to F3, which is pretty impressive after only one season in F4. So then be given the opportunity to race an F3 car and at an F1 support race as well. Pretty incredible, and an iconic circuit as well. But yeah, that's one of the great things actually for in my opinion of this year is one of the good things to come out of this year. Obviously all of the bad things that have happened with COVID, but for Formula One series has been quite different to how it would have normally been. They've raced at a lot of different tracks than they normally would, because they've not been able to, for logistical reasons, they haven't been able to go from one side of the world to the other and back and across. They've had to limit where they're travelling, and so they've been going to a lot more European circuits and stuff, and a lot more the old classic circuits and some new circuits that have been really popular. Obviously Imola they're going back to this weekend, which I don't think they've raced at Imola for 15 odd years or something, and it used to be a regular circuit on the calendar, and it is an iconic track. They went to the Nürburgring in Germany, which is very iconic racetrack.
Even I've heard of Nürburgring.
Yeah, Nürburgring. There's obviously the shorter race track version, which is nowhere near as long and dangerous as the bigger one. But yeah, they went back to that for the first time in a few years. And they also went to Portugal last week as well for the first time in God knows how long, and a new track there they've never been to. So there's there's been a lot of going back to classic tracks or exciting new tracks over the series. For me, that's one of the good things that's come out of this year in terms of motorsport.
Awesome.
Is going rather than maybe going to some of the more sort of far-flung places where motorsport isn't so big, and there's question marks, I guess, over what the motives are to go there, I guess is probably the politest way to put it. They've been going to more of the true racing places. But
Oh, amazing. Well, I think I speak for both of us when we say we're wishing Abby all the best of luck, even though this episode will probably come out after the race. But we're sending her a lot of spiritual energy and good wills. Thank you very much for listening. If you want to find out more about the women behind the Visor, please check out our social media pages, links in the description below. And feel free to check out our YouTube channel for more episodes. Goodbye and take care.